It has been another week of big news in the race for the White House. New polls suggested Kamala Harris was trailing in the Sun Belt states like Arizona, which means she absolutely would have to win the northern swing states like Pennsylvania. Democrats breathed a sigh of relief, though, when attempts to change the electoral college votes of Nebraska failed, or look like they have. We'll explain why that matters. Plus, massive controversy in North Carolina could help her there. And just before we came on air, some potentially huge news with the suggestion that Kamala Harris might abolish the filibuster in the Senate to ensure a national abortion guarantee was passed. We will explain why that might be huge news. Welcome to Talking Politics USA. Hello and welcome to another episode with exactly 6 weeks, just 6 weeks to go until polling day. I'm joined from Washington by our polling and elections expert, Jessica Taylor from the Cook Political Report, and by our US Correspondent, Dan Rivers, who, as you can see, is standing right in front of the UN Assembly building in New York to talk about primarily matters relating to the Middle East. And we will come on to that later in the show, Dan. But can we just talk, Jessica, can I come to you first? Because this obviously takes a bit of explaining for a UK audience. The filibuster is obviously the procedure designed to, ensure American people against the tyranny of the majority, as its supporters, I guess, might put it. You need a 2/3 majority in the Senate to pass various key legislation. Can you explain what it is, why some people defend it, and why Harris might be considering removing it?
Yeah, so it is sort of the upper chamber has had this tradition of, again, protecting sort of the minority rights and that you need 60 votes to advance legislation. Now, some of that has been moved back already, particularly on judicial nominees and on Supreme Court nominees. We've seen now that it's just a simple majority. But what Harris said in this interview with Wisconsin Public Radio today while she was there was that she would support abolishing the filibuster in order to enshrine abortion rights, to go back to a Roe v. Wade. I think this is significant for a couple of reasons. We see that abortion is one of the leading issues, that she is polling so much better over Donald Trump, 20 points or more. She has an edge on abortion. I was talking with a lot of Republicans this morning, members of Congress, and they know that this is a very difficult issue for them, and former President Trump did not give a good answer on it in the debate, while I think she has a very compelling issue. But I also think it could be designed because, listen, when we look at at the Senate, House, and the presidency, the Senate is the one that's most likely to fall. I actually think right now Republicans have, probably at least an 80% chance of winning the Senate. So I think this is also trying to shore up and to get her, if she wins the presidency, to keep a Democratic majority. They have a 1-seat majority right now. They're likely to lose, I think, at least 2 seats in that regard, or to make it a close vote to where you do have some moderate Republicans that support abortion rights that might flip over to that. But then again, I think there is, as they've sort of changed these rules for specific judges and different things, that it's great when you're in the majority, but if you're in the minority, then you don't like it as much. And that's what some of the moderate Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema that have opposed changing the filibuster on issues like this, and on they've tried to push to change it on voting rights in the past. Joe Biden has. So I think again, it's designed to really emphasize that as an issue, because it is one that brings, even moderate Republican and particularly Republican women that don't like Trump into her corner.
Dan, we know that a lot of people are very motivated by the issue of trying to ensure that Roe v. Wade is codified across the country. What do you think the raw politics of this? Is it really about super motivating those voters to try and demonstrate that if they put her in the White House, there is a real, genuine chance of getting Roe v. Wade, the national right to an abortion, basically written into legislation? Is that the raw politics of it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's trying to put that issue back up at the top of the political agenda. She's taken a lot of sort of heat over the economy. That's something, we've had a half-point cut in interest rates. That's sort of helped. The stock market's doing well here, but generally people are feeling the economy's been pretty bad for them. This is an effort to put abortion back at the top of the agenda. It's predicated, though, is it not, I think, on them retaining control of the Senate, which is not guaranteed, as Jessica just alluded to there. So, there's some hurdles that they'd have to get over to change this rule so that they would not have to have a 60 majority in the Senate to get stuff through without a filibuster. So, there's a few hurdles there, but, potentially it could be significant if they could achieve that. But clearly it's designed to grab some headlines, whether in reality it's actually realistically going to happen. And I think there are a number of vulnerable Senate seats for the Democrats in places like Montana where, it's going to be very close. So, I think there's a lot of things we need to get past first before this was to become a political reality.
Jessica, you will correct me if I'm wrong here, and I might well be, but my sort of memory of the history of the filibuster is it was, for example, used by, in some cases, racist Southern senators to block civil rights legislation, and it was intensely controversial at that time. It also has its supporters, as you were saying there, people who say it's one of the ways of entrenching, preventing the kind of tyranny of the majority. Can you just talk us through, one, how you change it? I mean, presumably you don't need 60 votes to change it, I'm assuming. So that's the first question I have. And the second question is, when this, argument plays out across America, given that it has its opponents and its supporters, how do you think it really is going to play out in these final days?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It absolutely was used, back during the Civil War and during Jim Crow era and things to sort of reinforce those racist policies and things. But, as we look at it today, it is, again, things in the House pass on a simple majority, but on the Senate, it's always sort of been to protect sort of states' rights, the fact that every state gets 2 senators versus, larger states. So it's sort of seen as more of an equalizer for all of the states and things. And it would only take a simple majority to change it. And again, President Biden led that push as well and was met by 2 moderate senators who are now no longer running for re-election. But again, I think it is sort of, do you change it? And I think, they've changed it for Supreme Court nominees. And I think there was sort of a little bit of ruining the day that they did that by both parties in some instances, particularly on the Democratic side. And I think it gets into a lot of procedural issues, and I'm not sure that breaks through with voters. I don't see it as emerging. It's certainly a big motivator for the base, and I think that Harris has that in her corner. But I think when she frames it on abortion only, that's what stands out to me more. And again, even though you do have more, I think certainly more than 50 senators in the Senate that would support codifying Roe, and probably many Republicans that wouldn't even vote for it, that would like it to no longer be an issue that was injected back into the race in 2022, I think even some of those that might support it would be hesitant to sort of vote to change the laws. I mean, the Senate is a very institutional body, and certainly it has, sort of the gentlemanly nature of it in a way with women now, of course, has decreased over the years as we've seen this sort of increase in negativity in our politics, but it is sort of seen as the more collegial body of the Congress as compared to the House.
Okay, let's move on to talking about Arizona, because Dan, you've just been there, and let me set that up. Abortion is, of course, a key dividing line in the state that we are going to take a deep dive in, which, as I said, is Arizona. It is part of the so-called Sun Belt in the south of the country, and along with reproductive rights, the state's location on the southern border means immigration is also a very hot topic there. In 2020, Joe Biden won the state by just 10,000 votes. You may even recall the point at which Fox News alienated President Trump, at least for a while, by calling it in Joe Biden's favor. Now, Dan, as I said, you have just been there. So let's hear from some of the residents that you spoke to.
I feel like Trump is the best chance for America to secure their border and take back the ground that's been given away.
They would go underground, self-managed abortion, or go abroad, and women would die. Further restrictions or a national ban, it'll threaten women's lives.
We were better off as Hispanics and as Catholics under Trump's administration than we were the last 3.5 years under the Biden-Harris administration.
I'm super anxious about the election. It's been such a traumatic experience to grow up undocumented in the United States.
Dan, you've been there. What did you find?
Well, as you said, I mean, abortion is a real hot button issue there, as it is in a lot of other places. But there's a particular kind of dimension in Arizona, because it's got such a large Latino population, about a quarter of the electorate is Latino. Many of them, most of them are Catholic. So there is already that kind of tension between religious doctrine and the politics of abortion. And then, as you mentioned, you've also got the huge issue of immigration, a big border with Mexico there. And we talked to one ranch owner who particularly felt that he was feeling the effects of, he claimed, illegal immigration over the border, and and felt that Donald Trump was the only one to tackle it. And I asked him, well, do you not believe Kamala Harris when she says that's going to be a priority, she is going to reinforce the southern border? And he just very blankly said, absolutely not. That's just something she says. It's a soundbite to get elected. So that gives you a sort of flavour. We actually went into an abortion clinic, which was really interesting access, and talked not only to the doctors but also to a patient who was there for an abortion. And Arizona has pretty tight restrictions on abortion. You can't have an abortion once you are more than 16 weeks pregnant. The woman that we interviewed was there on the last day that she could legally get an abortion in Arizona. Now, that restriction of 16 weeks is going to be on the ballot in November in Arizona, called Proposition 139. That's the suggestion of removing that limit. So it's not just the positions of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump on abortion. Literally, abortion is on the ballot. It's one of the things voters will vote directly on. Do you want to change this limit, yes or no, removing this 16-week ban on abortion?
Jessica, the recent polls that seem to have come out, certainly the latest, suggest that Harris is behind in the Southern Belt swing states, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and ahead only marginally in the northern swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. We'll come on to the fact that if she won the northern ones, she would absolutely need the Electoral College vote from Nebraska in a minute. But let's just talk about the southern states. What do you make of the recent polls, and particularly the fact that the latest poll put her 5 points behind Trump in Arizona? Does that feel right to you? If so, what is it about?
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical of the 5-point shift. That seems to be a little bit of an outlier. In the average of polls that I look at, Trump is ahead, but it's by about 1.2 to 1.5 points. And some of the polls we've seen are all within the margin of error. Now, if there's more polls that come out in the coming week that shows, again, 5, 3, 4 points or something like that, I'm going to trust that more. But for right now, that big a shift in Arizona, I'm a little skeptical of. But I do think he is ahead in the state. And listen, as are many of these states, this state wouldn't even be back in play were Joe Biden still on the ballot, that Harris is able to motivate younger voters and Latino voters. But Trump has made inroads with Hispanic men, particularly in the state, with black men. And I think even more so than the economy, immigration remains the biggest issue that, we've seen a national poll that came out over the weekend from NBC that had her up 4 points in overall, but we saw that she's still behind 21 points. Trump still has the edge by 21 points nationally on immigration. Now that's down from 35 in July, but the economy issue is single digits. Listen, I think Harris is also, the Biden administration is weak with voters when it comes to immigration, and they also made Harris sort of the face of immigration and trying to get to the heart of sort of the migrants pouring over the border. Now, when they are able to frame it on who do you protect immigrant rights and different things, that's a winning issue. But when you have, I think the Trump campaign is focusing on crime and drugs and tying all of that together, and that's a really sensitive and salient issue in Arizona. So do I think that he's making inroads in Arizona? I think Georgia, another Sun Belt state, we saw a 4-point poll there. I think Georgia probably remains one of the toughest of the swing belt states. And then, North Carolina, I think, is also in play. I think, I've seen polls with her up and polls with her down, but I think, Arizona, Georgia, are those becoming a little bit more difficult? Possibly, but I want to sort of see the polls over the coming week and state-by-state polls to see.
Dan, one of the things we keep hearing is that the Democrats' ground game just vastly, is on a different level to Donald Trump's ground game. And we keep hearing reports that, he's outsourced it to Elon Musk and others that the outsourcing is not very organized, not very together, and there's just too much reliance on in his campaign on his kind of ability to hog the news cycle and create national headlines, about which there's no dispute, by the way. Whether it's always good for him is a different question, but certainly coverage does revolve around him an awful lot of the time. You know, when you were on the ground in Arizona, how did it seem to you? And did that feel like it could be a factor, or is that overstated?
I think it's a bit overstated. I mean, I think both of them are flooding these states as much as they can. This is where the election is won or lost. I mean, when we were out in Georgia, certainly the Republicans seemed very well organised. They had, very pinpointed databases on iPads. They knew exactly who in which street had voted how. They knew which ones were persuadable, which ones were already in their camp, and which ones were Democrats and they should just forget. So I think both of them are relying on these huge data sets, which are provided by third-party companies to try and pinpoint their door knocking. But going back to the polls, I agree with Jessica. I mean, this idea that Donald Trump is 5 points ahead, which is what the New York Times Siena poll found most recently, I think we've got to treat that with a huge pinch of salt. David Axelrod, the former Obama chief of staff, recently said, look, the polls bounce around here, there and everywhere, but basically the headline is it's going to be very close, and it still is close. And no matter you see a poll that puts one of them slightly in front in one of the swing states, if you look at the averages, it's all margin of error stuff. It really is incredibly close, which is pretty incredible given that we've got a month and a bit to election, and some of the extraordinary things that come out of Donald Trump's mouth all the time that normally would be politically catastrophic for any other candidate, it seems to barely affect his poll rating.
Before we just move off Arizona, Dan, I ought to say that if anyone is listening to this or watching this before Wednesday, your report on Arizona is going out on News at 10. I'll be presenting News at 10 that night on Wednesday. Sounds like it'll be well worth a watch. If you're watching after Wednesday, I'm sure you can catch up with it on ITVX. Jessica, can we move on to talk about another Sunbelt state, North Carolina? Because there have been some extraordinary goings on there. And I think that's going to take some explaining to the British audience around Mark Robinson and what impact it might or might not have on the campaign. So who is Mark Robinson? Explain what's happened. And could you just explain to us why that might be impactful on the campaign?
Yeah, so there's an open gubernatorial race in North Carolina. It's currently held by a Democrat. The Democratic Attorney General Josh Stein is the nominee there. And Mark Robinson is currently the lieutenant governor. Now, he's a black Republican. He sort of rose to fame. He had this sort of viral moment at a local city council speech talking about gun rights and school choice. And so he sort of really came up from the grassroots. He has a very Donald Trump-inspired style of thinking and speaking. But he's courted controversy before. He said a lot of negative things about women, about LGBTQ people. He has denied the Holocaust. So, listen, I think he was a very damaged candidate before, and Republicans nominated him anyway, and I think that was a risk that they took. But there was new reporting that came out this week from CNN that he had, about 10 years ago, had written on this pornography message board. He called himself a black Nazi. He said that he he's been against transgender rights, that he was viewing he liked transgender pornography, and that he, when he was a teenager, was peeping in women's locker rooms. And that's like the things that they could publish. There were a lot more salacious things.
Well, he also said that he wanted to see slavery brought back, and he'd quite like to own some slaves himself, which is niche to say the least.
Yes, and again, Trump has supported him in the past. He's called him better than Martin Luther King Jr. You have heard Trump go silent on him. You see the National Party abandon him. I think this race is basically over at the gubernatorial level, but when I was talking with sources last week here in North Carolina, they were trying to push him to step down, but the ballot deadline missed. Mail-in ballots have now already gone out in North Carolina. It was not about saving Mark Robinson. He is not going to win. It was about, they're worried about a drop in Republican enthusiasm for Trump. And again, those Sun Belt polls we saw, it was the closest of the Sun Belt states. And, North Carolina does not have as high a black population as Georgia, but it's very significant. It has a high number of college-educated voters, white voters that have moved into the state. And a lot of these are very turned off by those things. So we've already seen the Harris campaign go up with advertising tying Trump to Mark Robinson. And again, Republicans I've talked to are very worried. We typically don't see down ballot candidates impacting the top of the ticket, but it sort of is a sinking boat can drag them down. There's a lot of worry I'm hearing. And, in North Carolina is a really critical state that Trump won in both 2016 and in 2020. And losing that state would really complicate his math and would be huge for Harris. So there's a real concern that because of what happened with Mark Robinson and the drag he could have on the ticket, that this could potentially cost Trump the state in such a close race.
We should point out that, Jessica, that was a brilliant explanation. I think we should point out Mark Robinson denies everything, so we should just point that out. Dan, given everything Jessica's just said there, the picture that emerges, let's just suppose the polls are right, and as you've both said, it's extremely close, we don't know. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, Trump absolutely must win North Carolina. Pretty much everyone agrees with that. Let's say he does. He wins Arizona, he wins Georgia, she wins Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and it's almost a dead heat. Unless I've got my maths wrong, it comes down to the electoral college vote in Nebraska. And there has been, the Republicans obviously have worked this out, appear to have had this attempt to change Nebraska's, the way it allocates its electoral college votes. This is another thing on this show that is going to require some explaining. Dan, I'll give this one to you. Nebraska's electoral college votes and why they've tried to change it. What's that meant and why has it failed?
Okay. Deep breath. Also, before I get into that, I must just say that Mark Robinson claimed in his denial that this had all been done by AI, that all these messages he left on pornographic websites were created by AI. Make that what you will. And he's threatening to sue CNN. So let's just get those denials absolutely in from him. But look, when it comes to Nebraska, there are two states where it's not a winner-takes-all in terms of the Electoral College, and they're Maine and Nebraska. And the Republicans were trying to change the system there. So instead of them being allocated in proportion to the number of votes for the House, it would be winner-takes-all. That's been defeated. So, as you were in Nebraska, but this was really an attempt, I think Jessica might agree, of the Republicans to try and sort of change the rules of the game pretty much as the game was underway, and they have failed in that, and so that is not happening. So that is potentially really significant if it comes down to a kind of almost tied situation. Maybe Jessica can explain that better than I just did.
That was a pretty good explanation, but Jessica, what can you add?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's sort of the Biden path that we were looking at, which was really thin. But if Harris, again, you need that Nebraska vote, and she is currently leading in that race. In our race ratings, we have Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, which is the most Democratic one, that's around Omaha, very more liberal, college-educated city, we rated as lean Democrat. And so this was sort of an effort to change the vote, because Nebraska as a whole is going to vote Republican. And it was too late to change the vote in Maine, whereas Maine overall is going to vote Democratic, but Maine's 2nd congressional district is favored to go to Republicans. And so there was this push, but Nebraska has a unicameral legislature. There's only one, and it's more nonpartisan. And so you have seen some members stand up and say, I won't change the votes this late at the game. And as Dan said, now the governor has said he will not call a special session to do that, but you were seeing Republican members of Congress go on TV trying to push for this, travel to the state. And, I'm even hearing that, listen, the Trump campaign could have done better targeting Nebraska if they wanted to win this, that they really haven't done as good a job here as they've focused on other states. Instead, they're sort of trying to change the rules very late.
And to be clear, if the Republicans in Nebraska had changed and they'd been awarded, it would basically mean a dead heat. Is that right? Like if both went Republican and everything else split in the way we said, and therefore it would come down to a vote in the House, and obviously there are more Republican states. Is that correct, or have I slightly miscalculated the numbers there?
Well, it would be you just get one electoral vote per congressional district.
Yeah.
So while Donald Trump would get the rest of the 5, so he would get 4, but Harris wouldn't get that 1. So that 1 could make it 270 versus 269.
Yeah, but if he changed it so that they all went Republican, it would be
Yes.
it would be a tie. And then it would be down to a vote in the House where every state has
Yes.
one vote, and there are more Republican states than Democrat states, which is why I'm guessing the Democrats invested so much energy in
Yes.
it. Okay.
Yes.
Just wanted to be clear, I got my maths right. It would be important on election night, if nothing else. Sorry, Dan, yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing to say is that the Republicans are already Donald Trump's campaign is already laying the groundwork for disputing the result, even before we've got a result, even while they're trying to change the rules in some states like Nebraska and failing. There is already legal teams being put in place. We've had this change in how they count the votes in some places, in Pennsylvania, I think. So it's going to be a hand count now. So, already the kind of arguments are starting about the result before we've even voted. So that gives you an idea of how contentious and bitter this is going to be, and also how, although you and I are going to be talking on the night, it might be and will be days or possibly weeks before we actually know definitively what the final result is.
I mean, it is going to be a fascinating night and possibly a fascinating few weeks as we wait, although I guess it's always possible it won't be close. You never know. We've learnt to not rely on predictions. It's been one of those weeks, whereas for political junkies, it's just for, I guess, like all of us, it's been kind of fascinating. As we said, so much going on, in Nebraska and North Carolina and all the rest of it. But let's just take a step back, since you're outside the UN, Dan, and talk about the Middle East. Look, we keep being told, Dan, that there are tens of thousands of US troops in the region, that there are more being sent. I mean, why? What is the planned use, if any? What's the purpose of them being there? I mean, presumably we're not going to see US troops on the ground anywhere.
No. I don't think that's the plan, but I think they are. Well, part of it is sending a signal. Part of it is in preparation, for regional escalation if they need to start, doing mass evacuations of embassies and US citizens. So there's a lot of naval assets already in the Eastern Mediterranean. They're bolstering that, but at the end of the day, the US is going to stand by Israel no matter what happens, and they need to ensure that they have capability there in case it is needed. But there's no doubt that the situation, the alarming escalation in the Middle East with regard to Lebanon is certainly something that's dominating the talks in the building behind me. It was mentioned by President Biden in his speech, which is effectively his sort of swan song at the end of his presidency. He also alluded, to implored both sides, Israel and Hamas, to come to a ceasefire agreement, something that he's been unable to achieve. And I think that will be one of the defining failures for his foreign policy, that he hasn't managed to get that done since this war has been going on almost a year now. Now it looks like, things are potentially spreading into southern Lebanon as well. So some really worrying times for the international diplomats who are gathering here and who are managing to close down half of Manhattan while they meet.
As they do. Jessica, can I just ask you, if that is obviously dominating discussions at the UN as we imagined it would, is it affecting voters' minds, do you think? Are people undecided voters? Is it a factor in any way realistically in their decision, or are they focused on more domestic matters?
This is a domestic policy election. I think the only times we've seen there be a foreign policy election was, when we were involved in Iraq, and certainly we saw 2006 and 2008 elections as a backlash to that. I think that ultimately American voters only care when there are troops on the ground in significant amounts. But I do think that it is worth watching what's going on in the Middle East, because this is, with the situation between Israel and Palestine, this is a place where the Biden administration has been more weak with progressive voters. We saw uncommitted voters in Michigan and different things where there is a large Arab American population. Harris is, I think she's doing better than Biden is on that, and has staked out some differences, but again, still underscored her commitment to Israel. And with sort of younger progressives, that's not a super popular policy. And, I think that can she bring them on board even if they disagree with her? So I do think it is worth watching in those states. I'm not sure it's not voters that are necessarily going to vote for Trump, but do they vote third party or do they not vote?
Okay, not that many weeks left. I'm going to ask you both a slightly unfair question now. Dan, maybe you first. Purely analytically, would you rather be Trump or Harris at this point, and why?
Goodness. I'm sort of damned if I do and damned if I don't here.
I mean, purely analytically, not ideologically, just analytically. Who has got the most? Another way of putting it would be, who's got the most distance left to travel, and what do they need to do to close the deal?
Yeah. I think undoubtedly Kamala Harris has got the most upside, as they put it. She has, until recently, had the most momentum, certainly coming out of the conventions and so on. That seems to have stalled a bit, but I think maybe Jessica will agree that the ceiling for Donald Trump with his support is often said that it's quite limited. There is more headroom, as they call it, in the political circles here, for Kamala Harris to kind of try and grab those undecided voters in the swing states. She needs to do a better job on a number of issues, and I think the economy is the key one, to explain to people what she's going to do to make their lives better. And for all the kind of talk about the Middle East and international politics, as Jessica said, that is not what most voters are concerned about. Some in Michigan will be. Arab Americans might have strong views. It might keep them away from the polls. But the key thing is inflation, prices, and the economy.
Jessica, do you agree with that?
I do agree with Dan. Listen, Harris has the most money by far going into this. She has, I think, the better organized ground game. We talked a little bit about this, but I am hearing some concerns among Republicans. Listen, I think state party differences, but like the fact that they are outsourcing this I am hearing sort of some Republican heartburn on that. And then I think it is the economy that we've seen in that NBC poll I referenced. In July, Trump had a 22-point advantage on the economy. It's now down to just 9 points, and this didn't fully take into effect the lowering of the interest rates. We've certainly seen gas prices go down here in the area. I was able to get gas for less than $3 a gallon, which I think that is just when you get below that, I think there's something that psychologically helps you think that things are going down with voters. And so I do think she has that, but is this race put away? Absolutely not. And we've seen Donald Trump, even with less money, with less organization, win before and really come very close to winning in 2020 when all of the indicators said that he should not have. But, again, what Dan said too is that he is not doing really very much of anything to grow his support. Sort of he has this base and it turns out. So it's just, can Harris corral enough voters? And I do think she is the one speaking more to undecided voters. But are there enough of those to make a difference in some of these states? We will see.
Good Lord, it is a fascinating race, isn't it? But thank you. That was a really, really interesting chat. Thanks so much for your time. That's all we have time for. We'll be posting new episodes every week for you to watch on ITVX, or do listen via your favourite podcast platform. Please do subscribe, as you wouldn't want to miss out as we get closer and closer to polling day, and it'll make our day. But for now, from all of us here on Talking Politics USA, goodbye.